St. Michael's, Austin. This is the Reverend Dr. Mark Andrew Jefferson, and I'm so very pleased that you would extend the opportunity for me to be able to share with you during this Easter speaker series. I'm grateful to my new and fast friend, Father John Newton, for the opportunity to be able to share with you and to be able to get to know you a little bit better. Hopefully, as the world finds a new sense of normalcy, we'll be able to fellowship in the future face to face and bump elbows in person. But until then, thank you so very much for allowing me to share with you my reflections on the hope that's inside of me and the hope that emanates from the inside of me. When I received the question, I found it to be very, very curious, because we pose a question similar to this, if not the same question, to our introductory students in our homiletics course. Dr. Ruth Anna Hook and I, we both teach homiletics here at the Virginia Theological Seminary. And so in our co-teaching, we want to make sure that students are able to embody their own witness with their encounter with God, because that is the power, and that in that lies the potential for a very fervent and passionate preaching life. And so inviting students to explore what it means to be faithful to God in that way, and what does it mean to be faithful to the flesh that they're in and to the experiences that they have, and what does it mean to cultivate one's spirit. That in that is the cultivation of witness. And so asking our students to bear witness to the hope that's inside of them is a very personal thing, because hope is grounded in someone's reality. And so what gives one person hope may or may not give another person the same type of hope, which may or may not lead them to a similar or a different outcome. So when we talk about hope and bearing a hope that's inside of us, hope is a very personal thing. And so thank you for allowing me to go first and to share my perspective. Hopefully it'll be something that enriches you all. As I've mentioned in our podcast, our seminary, Virginia Theological Seminary, turns 200 years old in 2023. Our bicentennial is an opportunity for us to celebrate and to reflect and to bear witness to the ways in which this institution has shaped our nation and our world. What I appreciate about our seminary is that in realizing that, being engaged in the makings of our nation for the last 200 years, it must take its fair share of responsibility for the ways in which it has been enmeshed in the frustrations and the frailties, the oppression, and the opportunities that are part of the American story, if you will. So, to highlight this opportunity, Dean Marker, our president, he approached me with the possibility of preaching 200 sermons leading up to our bicentennial celebration. Well, I said yes. Nothing makes a preacher happier than to have a chance to preach. But out of this invitation to preach 200 sermons over 5 years to lead to a bicentennial celebration, I had to ask myself some questions about not only my own spiritual life, but I also had to ask questions about how is this going to serve the church. So the questions that animated me at this time of the asking were, how am I going to be able to do this? What am I going to learn? And what is God placing on my heart to be able to share with, at least 100 and some odd congregations, to be able to preach 200 sermons? What is God giving me to say? And so I didn't have all of the answers worked out when I began this journey. I say, in many ways, it's akin to changing a tire on a moving car. But even in that, I've seen God's grace work through the experiences that were had to be very, very transformative. But one of the takeaways that I've been able to ascertain thus far, as I'm approaching around the 100th sermon, I think that 100th sermon will occur in September of this year. So, considering COVID kind of put a wrench in things, we're still on pace. But one of the opportunities that I was able to really glean from and still glean from is the ability to travel to churches and to see churches in their own sphere, to drive into a church, into its neighborhood, into its city, into its region, into its county, and to be able to see the community that supports this church, which is its own community. And being able to do that has been a tremendous blessing to me, because I've been able to see the Episcopal Church in its various forms and fashions. I've been able to see the Episcopal Church in Kansas and New Mexico and California and Texas and Mississippi and Georgia and Massachusetts and Ohio and Nebraska. So the ways in which God has moved these places to be faithful, and the way God has moved these places to wrestle with who they are and what God is calling them to be in the future, is one of the tremendous opportunities of my life. And so preaching in churches with 5 people and 15 people, and churches that have thousands of people, the hope that's inside of me is not in the fact that churches are still trying to meet. That's hopeful in and of itself, but human beings are going to want a sense of belonging in some form or fashion. But the hope that's inside of me is that what makes the church is the witness that it bears in the world, into the world. And I'm seeing that more churches are embracing a call to being more and more true to the gospel message, and not true to the ways that we've typically just understood the gospel message to be. So what do I mean? In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24, I believe, Jesus is appearing to the disciples after the resurrection. This is after the road to Emmaus, where Jesus revealed himself to the gentleman walking. But he's revealing himself now to the disciples who were at a place in their journey where they could either go back or try to go back to the life that they knew, or they can deal with life without Jesus. Well, Jesus meets them so that there is not the option to go back. The question is now, how do you go forward? So the resurrection has occurred. God has wrought this work in the earth, bringing Jesus back to life, and not just an apparition or a ghost of Jesus. No, but Jesus in bodily form. Jesus manifests himself to these disciples. These disciples have mixed feelings about the resurrection at this point, because they witnessed, even in their cowardice or even in their aloofness, they were still witness in many respects to Jesus's murder, his death, Jesus being a victim of capital punishment. So much so that in the book of Acts, chapter 3, the book of Acts talks about how in Peter's sermon that the group that gathered, they killed the author of life, right? They didn't necessarily kill him with their hands, but their complicitness in the system that allowed Jesus' life to be consumed in that fashion made them witnesses and complicit in this act of political, social, and religious defilement. So it is in this witness that the church finds its voice. It's in this witness of a risen Jesus that a church finds its impetus for being in its mode of attending to the world. But it's not just any witness that matters, but it's a particular type of witness. If we go back to this 24th chapter of Luke, Jesus appears and appeals to his disciples, but the appealing and the appearance is not based on the perfection of Jesus, because the perfection of Jesus is not the message that's going to resonate. Yes, Jesus is resurrected, but the message of the resurrection has a palpability because it is grounded in a flesh on flesh reality. So Jesus understood that the disciples would wrestle with the reality of the resurrection. Their identities are going to be challenged. Who they thought they were going to be, how they thought they were going to live, how they thought they were going to have to navigate the world. All of these things are now being tossed up into the air into ways in which they did not even expect. But Jesus says, let me authenticate myself to you all. I'm not a ghost. Look at my hands and look at my feet. Look at the instruments that I use to be a blessing to people. Look at the instruments that I've used to heal and to travel and to bless and to console. Look at these instruments and how the strange configuration of Roman military and political power and the corrupted religious authorities, how that power came together to produce these marks on me. So when I come back, I'm going to bear the marks of that experience. So Jesus is saying, I'm authenticated to you because of the wounds that I took on. And this is where my travels and this is where my hope kicks in, because it is in the opportunity to tell and bear a wounded witness that performs the prospects of us having a different way of attending to the world. It is not telling the glamorous story or telling a hopeful reality without dealing with the actual isness of things. Because in the isness of things, we end up dealing with the woundedness of humanity. It's in the intersection and intercourse of human exchange that we understand all the more what it means to be human, to be wounded, to be frail, to be broken, to be brittle, to be confined by time, to be terrestrial, and for our bodies to be earthbound. It is in the exchange with other clay vessels that we realize our temporality. So the witness that we're asked to bear, the witness that the disciples were asked to bear, is not a gospel of glamour and glitz, but it is a wounded gospel. It is a gospel that understands the ways in which living in this world and making God's claim on this world will also make a claim on us. And it is in this place where God is calling us today, calling us as a church, Catholic, small c, where God is calling us in terms of the local church, where God is calling us in terms of the national church, where God is calling us as individuals. We're being asked we're being compelled to bear a wounded witness. What does a wounded witness look like? A wounded witness, in terms of where we are as a seminary and where I am as someone preaching on behalf of a seminary who is attending to and bearing witness to this wounded and this conflicted history, is that you have a seminary that its core buildings were built by enslaved persons, in an area that was torn apart by slavery and the Civil War, supporting parishes with clergy who espoused these beliefs and purported them theologically across the country and around the world. But at the same time, while these wounds were being perpetuated, the gathering also in many ways called attention to the ways in which this gathering was perpetuating these things. So the seminary became wound in terms of place where these occurrences are happening, but that place of woundedness is also a place of healing. So we are a long ways off from full reconciliation, if that's even a term that we could get into another time. But what it does do is, by telling a whole truth or a fuller truth about our existence and how we arrived here and how did we achieve the things that we achieved, and what is God asking us to do, and what is the just thing to do, as God continues to call us into being of more account as we continue to find our way in the Episcopal sphere and begin to make our claim on our voice in the public sphere. It has to be a wounded message. It has to be one that is touched with the feeling of infirmity, not just because the acquaintance of guilt, but by telling a full story allows us to reflect the outworkings that Jesus wants us to do. By going back to the text, Jesus is saying, I'm asking you to bear witness. I'm asking you to take your experience with me, to remember, right? Another way of thinking about resurrection, another way of approaching it, is a way of remembering, right? So you dismember, you take it apart, but you remember, you put it back together. And so this remember, so that whenever you see this wound, you remember, you put back together how this happened, why this happened, who did it, under what circumstances, under what context did this happen. It is in this pursuing of a wounded story, a wounded gospel, that allows us to fully embody an ethic of, the text goes on to say, forgiveness and repentance. Because the evidence of a church that is bought into resurrection is the way in which they live in fellowship with neighbor and self. And part of that fellowship is our Christian witness that some people will call preaching. But regardless of what you call it, our Christian witness, wherever our 2 feet are, wherever we are physically, our Christian witness is what God is asking us to bring. And not just to say, but to be. So the hope that's inside of me is the fact that this church, the Episcopal Church, and God's church around the world is turning into a preaching church, a church that doesn't need a preacher to preach for it as the only means of expression, but a church that has enough textured and varied experiences with God that are equipped and are mobilized and are finding the voice and the embodied emotion to express their hopes, their agonies, their frustrations, and their optimism with God's work in the world. So I hope you all were able to get a glimpse of how I am hopeful in these strange and eclectic times that we're in. Times that have us wondering which end is up. Don't fear. God is in the midst. God is still doing the work that is necessary for us to continue to meet God in that place. God is constantly providing opportunities for us to confront our reality so that we can tap into that godly hope. And I believe that these times and these struggles will continue to spur us closer to God if we allow that to do so. Thank you so very much for allowing me to share with you. I'm so very pleased that we've had this chance, and I look forward to being with you as time permits and as God allows. Thank you so very much. You all be blessed.